Now we're going to work on the skirt. We're going to start with the front, and we're going to put right sides together. We're going to sew this front seam with the single notch. We're going to pin, and we'll sew from the top to the dot. We're going to clip the seam to the end of the stitching where the dot is. Now we're going to iron open the seam just to the dot so that top part lays nice and flat. Now we're going to sew in the godette. We're going to take half of your skirt seam, take the other part of the skirt and kind of fold it up right to the end where the dot is. Then you're going to take your godette and line that up. The little dot at the top lines up with the bottom of the seam where the dots are on the skirt. And I'm going to pin that. Place. Okay. And we're going to sew that from the bottom right up to the top of the seam line, making sure the other side of the skirt doesn't get stitched in there. Okay, so now we're going to repeat that for the other side. I'm going to fold this around, pull the bottom part out, and we're going to pin the other side. of the skirt to the godette. Okay, now we're going to sew this. We're going to start right at the bottom of that seam where the dot was, and we're going to sew it on this side, making sure that we don't catch the other side of the skirt. Okay. So now we're going to iron the top part open, and then these other parts to the side of the skirt, so this lays flat. Okay, in order to finish this seam, we're going to fold the seam out with the skirt back, so just the seam is exposed here, and we're going to run it through our serger down the top and right along the edge here of just the seam. And then once again we'll iron this nice and flat, and then the seams are finished. So now our seams are finished and ironed nice and flat, and we're going to repeat this for the front sides, the side seams, and the side back seams. So there's a total of 7 godettes in this skirt. So now we have our skirt, and we have one more section. We have the actual backs to put on here. This is the side back, and we're actually going to sew the side back, or the back onto the side back, just like you did the other ones. And I'm going to walk you through this one more time with the side back. So now we're going to put the side back, we're going to sew it from the top to the dot. And now we are going to clip to the dot. And we're going to fold up the side, and we're going to start sewing on our godette. We're going to line the dots up. Make sure they're right there. And the notches. And now we're going to sew from the bottom clear up to where the seam stops at the top. Don't get the other side caught in there. So now we're going to fold this up and then twist this around and line up the other side, the back with the godette. Okay. Make sure this other side is pulled out of the seam. You don't want to get this side caught in the seam. And so now we're going to sew from the bottom of that top seam again down to the bottom. You want to start right at the end of that. Otherwise you're going to end up with a little tuck or something at the top. And now we're going to finish these seams on the overlock or serger, and then our skirt will be complete. Now we are serged, and don't forget to iron this so the seams are out and nice and flat. Now our skirt is done. We're going to attach the skirt to the bodice. We're going to fold up the lining because we don't want to sew it to the lining. And then we're going to pin the skirt to the bodice. We're going to match the notches and the side seams. And the other seams will line up with in the vicinity of the pleats on the bodice. So now we're pinned on. We're going to stitch this. We're going to make sure that all of the seams stay flat. So now we're going to fold this up, and that seam will get ironed up towards the bodice. So now our skirt is on and ironed up. We're going to put in the zipper. So leaving the lining up, we're going to pin the back seam of the skirt part. And we're going to sew it from the bottom to this dot. this is right sides together. Okay. This is with just a regular stitch. Okay. Sewed that to the dot, and we're going to clip this to just the seam line. And now we're going to finish this lower half by running it through our serger and then ironing it to one side. So now our center back seam at the bottom is sewn and serged and ironed to one side. We're going to take the rest of the back seam, and you've got, it's wider here because we're going to put a zipper in, and you're going to pin lining the top where the lining is, and we're going to put the lining up because we're not going to sew the lining into this. And we're going to line that up so it lines up right there on that seam at the very top. And then we're going to line up where the skirt seam is. And we're going to stitch this right from the seam line where the lining is at the top, all the way down to the dot, and we're going to use a wide stitch because it's going to be pulled out later. And this seam is 1/2 inch. And we're going to stop where the seam starts at the bottom. Leave a tail because you don't want it to come out quite yet. And we're going to iron this open like that. So now we've got the top part ironed flat, and we're going to take just this seam allowance, fold the rest of the dress down, so you just want to sew on this seam allowance, and the linings are still up here, and we have our zipper, and because the zipper was longer than 5 inches, I cut off the top of the zipper at 5 inches, and we unzipped it. And we're going to line this up, and the teeth will line up right at the seam line right here. And we're only going to stitch on the seam edge, the seam allowance. And we're going to baste that, the bottom of the zipper down to the bottom of the flap, the seam allowance, and we're going to baste that onto that side. So I'm actually going to pin the zipper to the seam allowance. Okay, so when you get to the top of the, we're going to stitch it from the very top of the dress where the seam is for the lining, the neckline, down to the bottom. We're going to stitch it right along here, about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, from the zipper edge, the teeth. So it's basted on. So now we're going to zip this up to right at the top, and we're going to open this, lay it flat. Okay. And we're going to stitch this back seam. Okay, we're going to start at the bottom of the zipper, and we're going to stitch across and up on each side, starting from the bottom of the zipper and going up. And this is the zipper's laying flat underneath there. So you're going to stitch on either side of the seam. But first we're going to stitch across the bottom, so we can tack the bottom of the zipper. And then we're going to turn, and we will stitch up both sides. And make sure you don't get any of the other parts of the dress underneath the foot as you're sewing this. So when you get to the top, you're going to pull the collar down, because you're going to stitch the collar downwards in the back to hold the collar down. So we're just going to put a pin right here in the collar And then we're going to stitch the rest of that zipper right up through the collar. And so now we're going to switch our zipper foot over to the other side, and we're going to do the other side from the bottom. And since we've already got the stitching across the bottom, we don't need to do that, but we're going to start from there, the bottom, and go up to the top. And we're stitching this about a 1/4 of an inch away from the seam. When we get to the top, we're going to fold our collar down. Pin in it, and continue, making sure that collar doesn't get wrinkled when you sew over it. Now we're going to take out the stitching of the seam. And we have our zipper. I'm going to zip it down for now. And I'm going to trim off all of the threads from sewing. And we have our zipper. So now that our zipper is in, we are going to turn up the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on the bottom of the lining, and we are going to press that in. So now we have our lining back folded under and pressed in. We're going to do the same on the back edge. That's a 1/2 inch above where the zipper is at, and we're going to fold it and press it down at a 1/2 inch. So now we're going to fold the zipper down like this, kind of off to one side, and we're going to bring the lining down over the top of it. And we're going to line that lining up just on this side of the zipper. And we're going to pin it. And then we're going to pin it around the bottom at the skirt seam, the waistline. Turn under that 1/4 of an inch that we pressed in and pin it over the seam. And we're going to continue all the way around and then pin the other side back over the zipper. So now our lining is completely pinned on, covering all those raw edges in there. We're going to hand stitch it on, just like you did around the sleeve. And you're going to continue this all the way around and then back up the other side. So now to finish the zipper off, we're going to stitch a hook and eye at the top of the zipper. So there's our hook, and now we're going to sew on the eye. we hook